We've all heard about the great achievements of the Cold War tech boom. The SR-71 Blackbird, Apollo program, Sputnik, and Yuri Gagarin's first extraterrestrial excursion are all great examples. And even if you're not from America or Russia, you still probably think of these events when we first mention the Cold War. And that makes sense. Being the one to orchestrate a humankind first will get you a starring role in the history books. Fortunately for the interesting fact-based YouTube channels, decades later, America was not the only one fighting the Soviets. So, in the spirit of entertaining you with yet more Cold War governmental shenanigans, we present to you the British Space Program, a true guide on how to come third. Aspirations of British spaceflight began in 1933 with the formation of the British Interplanetary Society. It's an organisation that still operates to this day and holds the title of the oldest space advocacy group in the world. Shortly after World War II had drawn to a close, the BIS requested and were granted permission to study several of Germany's notorious V-2 rockets under Operation Backfire. It's difficult to overstate just how important Germany's development of the V-2 rocket was for the field of rocketry in general. After the war ended, the US, USSR, and UK all used the V-2 as a jumping-off point for their own rocketry programs. Without the V-2, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to suggest that rocketry, satellite technology, and space-based research in general would be many years, perhaps as much as a decade, behind what it is today. Case in point, only 6 months after Operation Backfire began, a proposal was written up requesting funding for a manned suborbital sounding flight using their newly developed rocket named Mega Rock. Unfortunately, this proposal was denied, thus beginning a trend of not prioritizing astronautical research and, well, falling rather behind other nations. The next 10 years were mostly consumed by private companies quietly researching their own ideas in rocketry. With the Cold War still very much focused on ground and air attack capabilities, any companies doing research into rocketry were flying under the radar, as it were. That was until early 1955 when the Soviet Union announced its intention to begin focusing research on putting artificial satellites into orbit. After that, it wouldn't take long for world leaders and engineering companies to put two and two together and see that a country capable of putting a satellite into orbit could also put a nuclear warhead into orbit, beginning what we now call the space race. The Americans turned their attention to the Gemini program, and across the Atlantic, the Royal Aircraft Establishment approached the Royal Society with an offer to begin building the UK's first functional rocket. This was approved, and the government agreed to provide £100,000 of funding, worth roughly £2.1 million in 2024. Considering that a budget of £2.1 million wouldn't even buy you a new Airbus A320 today, in fact, you'd be around £98 million shy of actually being able to afford one, the engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment should be given at least a pat on the back for successfully designing, building, and testing their rocket on that slender budget. Codenamed Skylark, the rocket used a basic solid fuel engine that produced so little thrust that if the wind was faster than optimal, the whole rocket had to be launched leaning over at an angle so as to not get blown over. However, once it actually left the ground, it was able to reach a height of just over 200 kilometers or 124 miles during testing. Over time, it received numerous upgrades and ended up being an incredibly cheap and reliable design, conducting 441 launches before its retirement in 2005, more than half a century after the first flight. Back in the Cold War, however, the experience gathered during the development process allowed the RAE to begin development of the UK's first ballistic missile, which was named Blue Steel. And do note that is not the last time that the UK space program and Hollywood are going to cross paths. It's worth noting that at this point, a UK government-based space agency was not yet established. That wouldn't officially happen until 1985. Any space-related research that was being done in the UK was by private firms that operated under the general guidance of the Royal Academy and the British Interplanetary Society. From the 1950s to 1985, the UK government, which was clearly intent on remaining a viable nuclear power in the Cold War, underwent a development spending spree on unmanned rocket technology. The general rule was that each rocket they developed should be capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, but also have a design that could be adapted to fit a larger rocket capable of carrying satellites to lower Earth orbit. This kicked off in 1954 with an agreement between the US and the UK to jointly develop a range of rockets. The US would develop an ICBM capable of traveling 5,000 plus miles, while the UK would focus on an intermediate range ballistic missile, or IRBM, capable of traveling a minimum of 1,500 miles. The UK submission was developed by the de Havilland Company, receiving the code name Blue Streak. Personally, we here at Mega Projects would have called it Brown Streak, so that you could say you hit your enemies with the brown streak, but that's just us. Anyway, after 9 years of development, they carried out its first launch in June of 1964 at the RAAF Woomera Launch Complex in Australia. Unfortunately, the rocket malfunctioned and crashed somewhere in the Australian outback. The actual body of the rocket wasn't rediscovered until 1980, roughly 260 miles away from the launch site, which is really just a comment on how ridiculously large Australia is. I mean, a rocket can crash land there and nobody notices. The second launched in October of the same year, and this time it was successful. Despite this, and then a second successful test flight the year after that, the project was cancelled due to budget constraints. Keen not to lose their money, however, the UK government decided to carry over what they'd learned from the Blue Streak to the new Black Prince program, which was the UK government's attempt to develop an all-UK-built satellite launch system. What was the Blue Streak rocket would eventually become the first stage for this larger rocket that was now in development. Originally, the second stage, known as the Black Knight, was intended to be composed of another rocket, developed for the purpose of learning how to build a rocket that could survive re-entry. It's worth interjecting here that the general blueprint for a satellite launch rocket at this time was to do it in 3 stages. The first stage is meant to be powerful enough to punch through the thickest part of the atmosphere. Then the second stage carries the payload through the thinner part of the atmosphere to just below lower Earth orbit. The third stage would generally be made up of the payload and just enough fuel to place it in the intended orbital area. As is often the case with these kinds of developments, however, the Black Knight program was itself cancelled due to budget overruns in 1960. Once again, the UK was still intent on not losing all their money, and they tried to recoup the cost by suggesting a partnership between several European nations to develop a satellite launch vehicle named Europa. Interestingly enough, this role is now filled by the European Space Agency's launch vehicle Vega. At the time, nothing like this had ever been attempted. Of course, now we have organizations like ESA, Airbus, and the Concorde program to point to as evidence that a conglomerate European effort is possible, but back then, it was a pretty radical idea, especially with World War II still firmly in public memory. Unfortunately, this project was not able to achieve its goals, and after several years it was cancelled. In a last-gasp attempt to keep the project going, a British industrialist by the name of Robert Renwick purchased 13 of the largest British aerospace companies and created a conglomerate by the name of the British Space Development Company. His goal was to create the world's first commercial communication satellite company with the backing of the UK government. It was a promising plan, but unfortunately, it didn't come to fruition. The government felt that the technology wouldn't be feasible for at least 20 years. Perhaps the most successful part of the UK space program, aside from their capacity to think of very cool code names for their projects, was the satellite program. Officially, it was kicked off in 1962 with the successful launch of Ariel 1, making Britain the third country to establish a satellite presence in space after the USSR and the US. In total, the aerial program comprised 6 satellites. The first 4 served as a means of studying the Earth's ionosphere, and the final 2 studied X-ray and cosmic ray radiation. For reasons unknown, the UK then decided to launch the final satellite using their own UK-designed rocket, now named Black Arrow, before ending the program entirely in 1979. Then there was Operation Skynet in 1969, and we told you Hollywood would be reappearing today. Still in operation nearly 60 years later, Skynet is a worldwide encrypted satellite communications network created to facilitate communication between the 3 branches of the British Armed Forces, but very little is actually known about this network for obvious reasons. The same can also be said about something known as the Zircon program. This was originally proposed to be the UK's best-kept secret, but it ended up being one of the biggest scandals in UK history. Really, the Zircon program could justify a video all on its own, but the short version is that the UK government spent £500 million, that's roughly £1.3 million today, developing a secret spy satellite named Zircon, so called because several of its primary components were made of a compound known as zirconium silicate. The intention was to launch it into geostationary orbit over the USSR as a means of eavesdropping on the Soviets. And this program really was as secretive as it gets. Only a handful of the top members of the UK government and her intelligence agencies even knew of its existence. But the problem wasn't that they were trying to spy on the Soviets. That was pretty much par for the course at this point of the Cold War. No, the problem was that nobody thought to tell the Chancellor of the Exchequer about the bill. In other words, they hid the expense from the UK taxpayer. Exactly where they got the money from is still unknown, but when they realized that a famous investigative journalist had learned of the program's existence, they issued an immediate gag order to all news outlets and began conducting raids on the BBC officers who had commissioned the journalist in the first place. For those of you who aren't familiar with democracy, this is referred to as censoring the press, also known as taking a bad situation and making it oh so much worse. Strictly speaking, the UK government is allowed to issue gag orders if the story is going to threaten national security, but it is a very, very bad look if your reasons for the gag order aren't rock solid. And by this point, the program had already been cancelled, so it's difficult to really see it as a threat to national security, isn't it? After 2 years of successfully keeping it under wraps, the Telegraph ended up being the one to illegally break the gag order and report the story. Outside of that little hiccup, however, the UK has had a pretty smooth record with their satellite programs. As of 2024, the Skynet program is in its 5th iteration, and the UK government is in joint ownership of a company by the name of OneWeb, the other owner being an Indian company called Bharti Enterprises. Seemingly, OneWeb is going to be a competitor to the likes of Elon Musk's Starlink, providing internet access via satellite arrays placed into low Earth orbit. The program so far has launched 74 of the planned 648 satellites, with further launch dates as of yet unknown. From the establishment of the British Interplanetary Society in 1933 to the modern day, there have been several organisations heading up the UK's space ambitions. The BIS was, of course, the first, and they did do some research for themselves. For example, they designed a spacesuit that looked like a cross between diving gear and medieval armour, and then there was the lunar lander that looked suspiciously similar to a giant bullet. Anyway, once the USSR made their announcement and began the space race, things became a little less dysregulated. But it would still take another 30 years before anything official would be established, that being the British National Space Centre in 1985. But the BNSC wasn't even a space agency in the strictest sense of the phrase. It was more accurately a voluntary council of 10 governmental departments, agencies, and research councils. Their main responsibility was to direct the UK's space-related interests both in civil and military applications. Perhaps the most notable and controversial decision made by the BNSC was their policy against manned spaceflight of any kind. It was for this reason that the UK did not make any contribution to the ISS during its construction, which in the fullness of history has generally become viewed as a bad call. All that changed, however, in April 2010, when the UK finally got around to establishing an actual space agency, imaginatively named the UK Space Agency, or UKSA. The previous responsibilities of the BNSC were folded into this new organisation, along with a hefty boost in funding, from just £500,000 in 2009 to £23 million in 2010. A clear message that the UK government has started pushing space-based research up the priorities list. In the short time it's been operating, we have seen a huge change in the direction that UK research has taken. For one thing, there is a clear intention with each new approved study. If everything you've heard so far seems somewhat confused or disjointed, it's because it was. There was no real cohesion to the projects that were taking place before the formation of the UK Space Agency. Previously, much of the work was determined by the whims of whichever department was funding it, but now the work can be consolidated and trimmed down to only include that which is necessary. Even so, it's unlikely that the UK will ever become the leading player in humanity's quest for the stars, but third doesn't sound so bad either, which, given the history of colonial expansion, is probably not such an awful outcome.